A millionaire abandons his black employee after getting her pregnant and expels her from his home. But years later, he faces a surprise he never imagined that will completely change his life. The soft music of a string quartet filled the air of the Evans mansion as guests, dressed in formal attire, moved like shadows amidst the glow of the chandeliers. Richard Evans, a successful billionaire, was at the center of the party, surrounded by executives and friends who laughed and toasted with champagne. The atmosphere was one of celebration, but inside Richard felt more isolated than ever. He was about to raise his glass when his gaze drifted to Angela, his employee of humble origins, who was serving canapés to some guests. She wore a simple dress, but the beauty and grace that radiated from her were undeniable. Richard felt a wave of tumultuous emotions, a mix of desire and guilt. The tension between them was palpable, but he convinced himself to ignore his feelings as he had done so many times before. "Richard, come on, we need you for the photo," called one of the executives, pulling him to the center of the hall. Richard forced a smile and joined the group, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't take his eyes off Angela, who was now chatting with a guest, her smile lighting up the room. The party continued, but Richard was distant. When the last song played, he retreated to his office, trying to find some peace amid the emotional turmoil. However, his solitude was interrupted by Angela's abrupt entrance, looking nervous. "Mr. Evans, I need to talk to you," she said, her voice trembling. Richard's heart raced as he saw the seriousness in her eyes. "Angela, now is not the time," he replied, trying to maintain his composure. "I'm busy." "It's important," she insisted, stepping forward. "I'm pregnant." Richard's world collapsed. He felt his stomach churn and his vision blur. "Pregnant? How can this happen?" he asked, incredulity and panic intertwining in his words. Angela lowered her eyes, her face pale. "I don't know, but it's true. I just wanted you to know." "You need to leave," Richard said, his voice sounding harsher than he intended. He couldn't allow himself to be vulnerable. What would people say? The scandal this could cause was unbearable. "But sir, I have nowhere to go. I can't just—" Angela began, her voice choked. "I can't stay here listening to this," he interrupted, feeling suffocated by guilt and fear. "You need to leave my house. I can't have this kind of problem in my life." Angela shuddered as if he had struck her heart. "Please, Richard, I just wanted you to know. I'm not asking anything from you. I just wanted you to know that I'll raise this child alone." Before we continue with this emotional story, take a moment to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any stories, and let us know in the comments which city you're watching this video from. Richard turned away, unable to face the pain in her eyes. "I think you should go now," he said, his voice lower but still firm. "Take your things and leave." With tears in her eyes, Angela walked away, leaving the room. Richard watched her leave, a growing weight in his chest. He felt surrounded by luxury and wealth, but the truth was that his life was empty. In that moment, the brilliance of the party felt distant, echoing only as a reminder of his solitude and the choice he had just made. He sank into a leather armchair, his head in his hands. What had he done? The life he had built seemed to crumble, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he had lost something he could never regain. The music from the party transformed into a distant hum, as Richard wondered if he would ever escape the shadow of his own selfishness. Angela settled in a humble neighborhood in Atlanta, where the streets were filled with simple houses but brimming with life. The morning sun filtered through the trees, creating a pattern of light and shadow in the small space she had chosen to open her restaurant, Taste of the South. This was a new life, far from the luxury of Richard's mansion, but also far from the pain that had accompanied her departure. The surroundings reflected her struggle, vibrant yet filled with challenges. The day of the grand opening arrived, bringing a mix of excitement and anxiety. Angela stood at the restaurant door, wearing the uniform she had made herself, emblazoned with the colors of the southern U.S. flag. She looked inside the restaurant, which had been carefully decorated with elements reflecting her cultural roots. The walls were adorned with photos of her family, traditional dishes she had learned to cook from a young age, and a large sign that read, "Welcome to Taste of the South. Here, every dish tells a story." "Angela," a familiar voice called, interrupting her thoughts. It was Marlene, a longtime friend who worked at a nearby beauty salon. "The place looks amazing. I'm so proud of you." "Thank you, Marlene. I hope people enjoy the food as much as I love preparing it," Angela replied with a nervous smile. Insecurity shadowed her, but the presence of her friend calmed her a bit. At first, customers were few, but Angela was determined to make her restaurant thrive. She remembered her mother's words. Persistence is the key to success. With that in mind, she decided to organize community events to attract more people. Every Sunday, she hosted a night of traditional dishes, with live music and dancing. "Food is the soul of our culture," she said as she prepared the dishes in the kitchen. One night, during an event, a lively group of customers danced to the sounds of a local band. Angela was in the kitchen, adding the finishing touches to a plate of fried chicken with okra and mashed potatoes. When she stepped out to check on everything, she noticed an older woman sitting alone at a table, watching the scene with a smile on her face. "Hi, dear. The food is delicious," the woman exclaimed, looking up. "You know, I haven't tasted anything so authentic since I moved here." Angela was delighted by the compliment. "Thank you. I'm so happy you're enjoying it. Every dish here has a piece of my story. You have an incredible talent. Don't give up on your dream. The community needs places like yours," the woman said before returning to savor her meal. The customer's words echoed in Angela's mind, filling her with determination. Even in the face of financial difficulties, when the bills piled up and the clientele was not as expected, she refused to give up. Each dish served was more than just a meal. It was a form of resistance and a way to honor her own story and that of her son, Michael. Days turned into weeks, and Angela saw her efforts begin to bear fruit. Sabre du Sol started to attract more customers, and the music nights became a local success. The community rallied around the restaurant, and Angela felt that she was finally creating something lasting. "Angela, you are a true inspiration," Marlene commented one busy night. "Look at how many people came. You made this happen." Angela smiled, but deep down, the memory of Richard still haunted her. "It's all for him, and for myself. I just want Michael to know that no matter where you come from, it's possible to rise again." As the restaurant flourished, Angela began to realize that her struggle was not just for survival, but for a legacy. She wanted Michael to grow up knowing that strength comes from perseverance, and that despite challenges, family and community are what truly matter. Michael Evans was at a turning point in his life. With his law school graduation approaching, he felt a mix of anxiety and anticipation. On that sunny morning in Atlanta, he looked at himself in the mirror and adjusted his tie. "This is your chance," he murmured to himself, trying to boost his confidence. He was not just about to become a lawyer. He was about to free himself from a burden that had followed him since childhood, the absence of his father. As he prepared, his mind wandered back to the past. Angela, his mother, had always been the rock in his life. Despite their financial and emotional struggles, she never let him feel like he was missing anything. "Mom, you are all I need," he used to tell her, and she would always respond with a sad smile, as if she knew the truth was far more complex than that. In college, Michael excelled, but the pressure of his background and the absence of his father haunted him like shadows. In civil law class, a classmate named Jake, who always seemed to feel superior, made a comment that echoed in Michael's mind. "You're just another kid from a single mom trying to feel important. What do you know about being a real man?" The provocation struck deep, and he could not hold back. "You don't know anything about me, Jake. My mom taught me to fight for who I am, and that's more than you'll ever understand," he replied, his voice trembling with anger. The room fell silent, and all eyes turned to them. Michael felt the weight of their gaze, but instead of shrinking away, he stood tall. "You might have it all, but I have something you'll never have. Integrity and the strength of a mother who fought to raise me." After class, Michael sought solace in his mother. He found her at the Sabre du Sol, where the aroma of fried chicken and spices filled the air. Angela was setting up the tables, and her smile lit up the space. "Hi, my love. How was class?" He approached her, frustration still pulsing through his veins. "Mom, I can't take it anymore. They don't understand our story. A classmate called me a single mom's kid, and I lost it." Angela stopped and looked into Michael's eyes, her gaze filled with understanding. "You don't need to worry about what others think. What matters is who you are and what you represent. The struggle we live shapes us in ways they'll never comprehend. But I want them to see that I'm more than that," Michael said, his voice thick with emotion. "I want my father to recognize me. I want him to know I'm here and that I'm his son." Angela's heart ached at the mention of Michael's father. "I know that's important to you, but remember, recognition doesn't define your worth. You're amazing, and I'm so proud of you. I want to be a civil rights advocate, Mom." I want to use my voice to help those who don't have one, Michael declared, a spark of determination igniting within him. But at the same time, I feel like I need the truth about my father. I need to confront him. Angela sighed, feeling the depth of her son's internal struggle. If you feel this is what you need to do, I'll be by your side. But be prepared, my love. The truth may bring more pain than healing. I know, but I can't keep living in his shadow. I need to understand who I am and where I come from, Michael replied, resolute. With Angela's support and strength, Michael decided it was time to confront the past. He enrolled to investigate more about Richard, his father. The desire to uncover the truth pulsed in his heart, and he knew this journey would be both a quest for identity and redemption. As he prepared for this new chapter, an idea began to take shape in his mind. He not only wanted to be recognized, but also wished to be a catalyst for change, an advocate for truth and justice. Michael had enrolled in law school with a fervor that even surprised his mother, Angela. Since he was young, he had shown an interest in justice and equality, but the reality of his life and the absence of a father figure left deep scars. Amid this search for purpose, he met Dr. Josephine Carter, a respected professor with a career dedicated to civil rights advocacy. On the first day of class, Josephine entered the room with a presence that immediately captured the students' attention. Her words were firm and filled with passion. "The law is not just a profession, it's a tool for change," she said, looking directly at Michael. "Each of you has a story, and those stories have the power to shape the world around us." Later, during a heated discussion about a landmark case of racial discrimination, Josephine noticed that Michael was particularly engaged. He raised his hand and shared his experience. "I grew up in a neighborhood where opportunities were scarce. For a long time, I felt like the color of my skin was holding me back from achieving my dreams. Now, I'm here, but I still feel like this struggle isn't just mine." Josephine smiled, encouraging him to continue. "And that is the essence of the law, Michael. One person's struggle is everyone's struggle. What you're doing is important. You're allowing yourself to feel that pain and turn it into something powerful." In the days that followed, Josephine became a mentor to Michael. She challenged him in every class, urging him to delve deeper into his reflections on identity and justice. "What is your truth, Michael? What do you really want to change in the world? What do you want for yourself?" she asked in one of their conversations after class. "I want people like me to be heard, for our story to be recognized," he replied, his voice heavy with emotion. "I want my father to know who I am and that I exist." Josephine encouraged him to share these experiences in a civil rights project being organized at the college. "You need to tell your story, Michael. This isn't just for you. It's for everyone who has felt invisible," she said, gesturing with enthusiasm. Thus, Michael began to work on his project, where he explored the injustices faced by people in his community and his own struggle for recognition. He collected testimonials, life stories, and started to form a support movement among his peers. Each day, he felt stronger, more connected to his identity. One afternoon, while discussing his ideas with Josephine, he said, "I feel like I'm finally finding my voice. But what if my father doesn't want to listen? What if he rejects me again?" Josephine encouraged him not to give up. "Rejection is part of the process, but it doesn't diminish the importance of your truth. Remember, you can't control how others react, but you can be authentic in your quest." With this perspective, Michael threw himself into the project. He organized an event at the college where everyone was invited to share their stories. The room was filled with students who, touched by Michael's courage, began to open their hearts. He felt enveloped in a spirit of solidarity and support. "This is just the beginning," he declared at the end of the event, looking at the encouraged faces in front of him. "We need to continue this fight. We need to be the voice for those who don't have the opportunity to express themselves. Together, we can make a difference." Dr. Josephine Carter watched with pride. Michael was transforming into a leader, someone who not only spoke for himself but for an entire community. "You're on the right path, Michael. Always remember, your story is a vital part of the fight for justice." And so, with his mentor's guidance and his mother's support, Michael felt increasingly ready to face the challenges ahead. Michael was determined. After months of research and reflection, he finally decided it was time to confront Richard Evans, the father he had never known. The discovery of the man behind his lineage consumed him, and the idea of finally gaining recognition propelled him forward. He sat in his small apartment in Atlanta, surrounded by law books and notes, reviewing the details of Richard's life. The information he had gathered was surprising, but also alarming. Michael knew he needed courage to face the man who had abandoned him. That day on his way home from college, he found Angela preparing dinner. The smell of home-cooked spices filled the air, evoking memories of his childhood. He hesitated before sitting at the table, knowing he needed to share his plans with his mother. Angela noticed the tense expression on his face and asked, "What is it, my son? You look worried." "Mom, I need to talk to you about something important," Michael began, his voice trembling. "I found out who my father is. It's Richard Evans." Angela stopped stirring the pot and looked at Michael, her eyes widening in shock. Silence hung between them, heavy with emotions. "Richard Evans?" she repeated, almost as if trying to process the information. "Are you sure? I researched it. He's a billionaire, and I want to confront him. I want him to acknowledge me," Michael affirmed, determination growing in his voice. Angela sat down at the table, her expression shifting from surprise to concern. She knew Michael's search for his father could unearth old wounds. "Michael, I don't know if this is a good idea. You don't know what he might do." "He might not want to know you," Angela said, her voice quivering. "I understand your fear, Mom, but I need to know. I grew up without a father, and now that I know who he is, I can't just ignore it." Michael interrupted, his voice rising. "I want to understand why he abandoned me." Angela took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her son's words. She stood up, going to the window, looking at the horizon. It was an internal struggle. Part of her wanted to protect Michael, but another part knew that the truth was essential to the healing process. "I just don't want you to get hurt. This search might not bring the answers you hope for." She turned to him, her eyes filled with worry. "What if he doesn't care? What if he doesn't want to know you?" Michael looked deeply at her, recognizing the pain and fear she felt. He stood up, going to her and taking her hands. "Mom, I can't live with this doubt. If he doesn't care, at least I'll know, and if he does care, maybe I can have a chance to have a father." He paused, searching for the right words. "I need to do this for me. For us." Angela felt a wave of emotions, hope and fear intertwining in her heart. She knew she couldn't stop Michael from following his path, even if it left her vulnerable. "If you truly believe this is what you need, then I will support you," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But I promise I'll be by your side no matter what happens." Michael smiled, relieved. He knew his mother's support made his decision easier. With a renewed sense of determination, he began to plan his next steps. The idea of confronting Richard transformed from a mere search for recognition into a journey of self-discovery. He wanted to understand his roots and, more importantly, find his place in the world. Angela, for her part, couldn't shake a feeling of apprehension. She knew Michael's life was about to change in ways he could not yet comprehend, but looking at her son, she saw the determination in his eyes and knew he was ready to face whatever came next. Deep down, this struggle was more than a search for a father. It was a fight for identity, for belonging, and above all, for redemption. Richard Evans sat in his office, surrounded by awards and photographs symbolizing his rise in the business world. The luxury around him was not enough to calm the storm of thoughts that plagued him. His cell phone vibrated on the table, and when he looked, he saw a message from his lawyer reminding him of the upcoming gala event he was expected to attend. But at that moment, nothing seemed more important than the tempest brewing in his mind. Michael, Angela's son, is graduating from law school, Richard thought, feeling a chill in his stomach. The idea that the young man could become a lawyer, someone who could unearth his past, left Richard feeling restless. He stood up and began pacing back and forth, his mind wandering into terrifying possibilities. When the door opened, Elizabeth, his ex-wife, entered. She watched him for a moment, sensing that something was wrong. "Richard, you look paler than usual. What's going on?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. "It's Michael," Richard said, his voice trembling. "He's about to graduate and he might very well come after me." "What do I do, Elizabeth? What do I do?" he questioned, anguish clear in his eyes. Elizabeth sighed, knowing he needed an answer. "You need to face this, Richard. Ignoring it won't solve anything. And if he uncovers the truth, you can't keep living in this bubble of denial. It's time for you to take responsibility." Richard felt a knot form in his throat. He had always been a pragmatic businessman, but the idea of an emotional confrontation made him feel vulnerable. "What if he turns against me? What if he sues me? Everything I've built could come crashing down," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "If you do nothing, Richard, you'll lose much more than just your fortune. You might lose the chance to know your son." Elizabeth replied, her voice firm. "You have to decide. Will you keep living this lie? Or will you have the courage to face the consequences of your actions?" Her words echoed in his mind. He knew she was right, but the thought of opening up to Michael, admitting that he was his father, was terrifying. Richard sat down again, his head in his hands. "What if I don't know how to be a father? What if he doesn't want anything to do with me?" He murmured, his voice shaking. "You won't know until you try. And believe me, Michael needs you just as much as you need him. This isn't just about you, Richard. It's about his life, about the story you helped create," she said, trying to persuade him to see beyond his own fears. Richard lifted his head, looking into Elizabeth's eyes. "Do you really think there's still a chance for my redemption? That he could forgive me for all of this?" Elizabeth hesitated for a moment, assessing the man who had once been her husband. "Redemption doesn't come easy, Richard, but you have to try. If you don't do anything, you'll be condemning yourself to live with this burden forever." He felt the weight of her words. The silence that followed was oppressive. Richard looked again out the window, where the sun was beginning to set, casting long, dark shadows across the room. "I can't keep living like this," he finally admitted, his voice faltering. "I need to do something." Elizabeth smiled faintly, encouraging him. "Then start preparing yourself. Face the truth. You might be surprised by what can happen." Richard took a deep breath, feeling a mix of fear and determination. He knew the journey ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in years, he felt a spark of hope. "I'll try," he said, more to himself than to her. "I will try." Michael looked out the window of the small apartment he shared with his mother, observing the bustle of the Atlanta neighborhood. Anxiety throbbed in his chest, almost like a drum that wouldn't stop beating. He had dreamed of this moment for so long, but now that it was so close, a wave of doubt washed over him. Angela was in the kitchen, organizing ingredients for dinner, when she sensed the heavy silence hanging in the air. "What's wrong, my son?" she asked, not turning around but knowing something wasn't right. "It's just, I'm thinking about what's going to happen tomorrow," Michael replied, his voice trembling. Angela paused for a moment, her heart tightening. She turned, wiped her hands on a dish towel, and approached her son. "You know you don't have to do this if you don't want to," she said softly yet firmly. "Your father may not be what you imagine." Michael sighed, looking down at the floor. "I need to, Mom. I have to know who he is. I can't keep living with this doubt. It feels like a part of me is missing." Angela felt a knot in her throat, recalling the pain she felt when she left Richard. "I understand, but you need to be prepared. He might not react the way you expect." "I know, but what if he opens up? What if I can get him to see me as his real son?" Michael lifted his eyes, seeking hope. Angela hesitated, remembering how Richard had once been a very different person, someone she had loved and yet been disappointed by. "Just remember, you are more than his son. You are an incredible man on your own, with or without his recognition." Michael nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He pictured Richard's imposing mansion, every corner filled with memories and wealth, contrasting sharply with the simplicity of his current life. The image of his father, distant and unreachable, consumed. The next day, the sunlight began to dissipate the morning fog as Michael and Angela arrived at Richard's mansion. The wrought iron gate creaked open, sending a shiver down Michael's spine. He turned the doorknob, which opened with a snap, revealing a luxurious hall that felt like an echo of the past. "Are you ready?" Angela asked, holding Michael's hand, their palms sweaty. "I am," he replied, though his voice was weaker than he would have liked. Richard was in the living room, surrounded by the trappings of wealth and solitude. He looked at Michael and Angela, his face contorting with a mix of surprise and discomfort. "What are you doing here?" he asked, defensiveness creeping into his voice. Michael, swallowing hard, found his courage. "I came to talk. We need to discuss us." Richard furrowed his brow, as if trying to comprehend what was happening. "Us? There's nothing to discuss." Angela stepped forward, her voice firm. "Richard, you can't just ignore what happened. Michael has the right to know who you are." Richard shook his head, a nervous laugh escaping his lips. "This isn't a conversation I'm willing to have." The tension in the room was palpable. Michael felt his heart race, but he couldn't back down now. He stepped closer, his gaze fixed on Richard. "I am your son, Richard, and I deserve to know why you abandoned me." The words hung in the air, a weight that could not be ignored. Richard closed his eyes for a moment, a shadow of regret crossing his face. "You don't understand, Michael. I did what I did to protect us all." "Protect from what?" Angela asked, her voice rising. "What protection are you talking about when you're the one who caused this pain?" Richard hesitated, the truth beginning to take shape in his mind, but the defenses built over the years kept him trapped. He looked at Michael, who now seemed more determined than ever. I don't know how to deal with this." Richard's response brought a heavy silence. Michael felt as if time had stopped. He was standing there before the father he had idealized for years, but the reality was much more complex than any fantasy he might have created. "So, is that it?" Michael asked, frustration evident in his voice. "You'd rather keep living in denial?" Richard looked away, and Michael realized that the struggle was only just beginning. Michael took a deep breath before entering Richard's mansion, his heart pounding in his chest like a drum. The opulence of the place was overwhelming, even for him, who had seen wealth in its most exaggerated form. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, and the walls were adorned with artworks that seemed to whisper stories of a life of excess. But none of that mattered at that moment. He was there for a specific reason, to seek recognition, not just as a son, but as a man who deserved to know the truth about his father. Upon entering, he confronted Richard, who appeared as imposing as the house he lived in. The billionaire looked at Michael, a mix of surprise and defense in his gaze. "What are you doing here?" Richard asked, his voice tense, almost a growl. "I came to talk to you," Michael replied, keeping his head held high. "I need answers. I'm your son, and you can't just ignore that." Richard hesitated, the muscles in his jaw tightening. "You don't know what you're talking about. This is madness." He turned to walk away, but Michael was unwilling to let that happen. "No, it's not madness." Michael pressed forward, determination coursing through his veins. "You may have all of this," he gestured to the mansion around them, "but I grew up without a father, and you took away my right to know who I am. I deserve to know the truth." At that moment, Angela, who had remained in the shadows, decided it was time to make her presence known. She stepped into the room, her eyes filled with pain and determination. "Richard," she began, her voice steady, "it's not just Michael you've hurt. I'm part of this story too. You can't just leave us behind." Richard turned to Angela, the expression of defiance on his face shifting to a mix of confusion and guilt. "Angela, I didn't want this to happen. I didn't know how to handle the situation." "You handled it in the most cowardly way possible," she replied, her voice trembling with emotion. "You sent me away as if I were a discarded object, but I'm not. I'm his mother, and I fought every day to raise our son alone, and now, you need to face what you've done." The tension in the room was palpable. Michael looked at his mother, recognizing the sacrifice she had made, then turned his attention back to Richard, who was clearly battling his emotions. "You need to understand that we're not here to attack you," Michael said, his voice softer now. "We're here because we want a chance to understand. Why did you do this? Why did you abandon me?" Richard hesitated, his gaze drifting somewhere beyond the present. "I was scared," he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I had a life, a family, a name to protect, and having a child outside of marriage, it would have ruined everything." "So you decided to ruin the lives of 2 others?" Michael asked, frustration seeping into his words. "Did you not think about the consequences? About how this would affect us?" Angela stepped forward, her strength intertwined with sadness. "Richard, you can't keep hiding behind your justifications. Life isn't just about what you have or what people think of you. It's about the people you love and who need you." Silence filled the room, and Richard seemed to struggle against an internal storm. For a moment, all he could hear was the echo of his own heart. He looked at Michael, who was waiting anxiously for a response, and then at Angela, whose expression conveyed both love and pain. I don't know if I can do this," Richard confessed, his voice trembling. "I don't know if I can face all of this." "Then would you rather keep living this lie?" Michael questioned, hope and frustration intertwining in his words. "You can't escape your past. The only way to be free is to confront it." The atmosphere was charged with emotion, and Angela, sensing this was Richard's chance for redemption, looked deep into his eyes. "Richard, you have the opportunity to change. For yourself, for me, for Michael. But you need to decide now." The emotional clash was far from resolved, but truths were being laid bare. Michael and Angela were ready to fight for a future that included Richard, but the final decision still rested in his hands. Richard looked at both of them, and in that moment, the weight of his choices began to become clear. Michael stood, heart racing, as the tension in the room escalated with each passing second. He looked at Richard, the man he had dreamed of meeting but who was also the source of his pain. The mansion's environment, a representation of Richard's material success, felt suffocating, as if the walls were closing in around him. The silence that followed his cry of indignation was deafening, and the burden of unspoken words hung heavy in the air. "You can't just ignore my existence, Richard," Michael began, his voice trembling but firm. "You abandoned me even before I was born. Here I am, a product of your choices, and you act as if I am nothing." Richard, visibly shaken, crossed his arms as if to shield himself from an attack. He looked down, avoiding Michael's piercing gaze. "I didn't know how to deal with this," he murmured, his voice almost inaudible. "You don't understand. I had a life, an image to maintain." "An image?" Michael echoed, incredulity and anger mingling in his tone. "And what about my life? What did you do to my mother? To me? Do you think your image is worth more than the acknowledgement of a son? You discarded us like we were trash." Angela, watching the scene unfold from a distance, felt her heart tighten. She knew Michael was just trying to express the pain he had kept bottled up for so long, but the intensity of the confrontation left her anxious. For a moment she hesitated to intervene, but when she saw the expression on Michael's face, she decided it was time to step in. "Richard," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion, "you need to hear what's happening here. This isn't just about you or your image. It's about a family you destroyed with your selfish decisions." Richard lifted his gaze, but his expression was defensive, not remorseful. "Angela, I didn't want things to turn out this way. It was a mistake, a huge mess. I didn't know what to do." "You never knew, did you?" Michael interjected with disdain. "You never wanted to know. And now, when I'm here, you still try to hide behind excuses. What do you have to say about what you did to my mother? To her life? To mine?" The silence deepened again. Richard seemed to be struggling internally, a battle he didn't know if he could win. It was as if Michael's words were breaking down the walls he had built over the years. "You can't just wait for everything to go back to normal, Richard," Angela said, her voice filled with deep sadness. "What happened between us can't be erased. You need to face the consequences of your actions." Michael felt the need to continue, the urgency to not let this moment slip away. He took a deep breath, trying to control the anger boiling within him. "I just want to understand, Richard. Why didn't you fight for us? Why didn't you try to do the right thing?" Richard looked at Michael, his son, and for the first time, the reality of what he had done began to weigh on him. I didn't know if I was capable," he admitted, his voice faltering. "I was scared of losing everything. I thought that if I distanced myself, I could protect everyone. But now I see that I only caused more pain." "Fear isn't an excuse," Michael replied, the pain in his voice transforming into a quiet determination. "You have a chance to make this right now. It's not just about me or you. It's about Angela. It's about a future that can be different if you're willing to try." Richard looked at both of them, a mix of confusion and despair in his eyes. He was at a turning point, and Michael's words echoed in his mind like a distant call. He didn't just have a choice to make, but also a path to confront his own guilt and the damage he had caused. The room was charged with emotion as the three faced one another, each grappling with their own truths, their own pain. Michael wanted answers. Angela desired reconciliation, and Richard teetered on the edge, faced with the choice of stepping toward redemption or remaining in the shadows of his past actions. Just when the conversation was about to reach a stalemate, the tension in the air was palpable. Michael, with his heart racing, was about to resign himself to the possibility that Richard would never accept him. He looked at Angela, who had tears in her eyes, but a quiet determination radiated from her. Richard, on the other hand, seemed lost in a whirlwind of emotions, struggling between guilt and the need to keep his life intact. It was then that the door swung open abruptly, interrupting the confrontation. A robust lawyer, with a worn leather briefcase, entered the mansion, bringing with him an air of urgency. He introduced himself as Jonathan, an old family friend, and immediately captured the attention of the three. "Mr. Evans," Jonathan began, his tone serious, "I need to speak with you about a matter of utmost importance." Richard furrowed his brow, confused and somewhat irritated by the interruption. The lawyer continued, I come from your father's office. He left a considerable inheritance, but there is a condition. You must reconcile with your son. The revelation dropped like a bomb in the room. Michael fell silent, his gaze flickering between Richard and Jonathan as he tried to process the information. Angela, on the other hand, couldn't contain her incredulity. What do you mean by reconcile? She asked, her voice trembling. Jonathan pulled a document from his briefcase and placed it on the table. Your grandfather, Richard, left a significant amount, but it is conditioned upon your acceptance of Michael as part of the family. If you do not do this, the inheritance will be directed to charities. Richard, stunned, looked at the paper, then at Michael. This is insane, he murmured, the words escaping his lips like an incredulous whisper. My finances shouldn't depend on a recognition I wasn't prepared to make. But isn't that what you want? Michael said, his voice heavy with emotion, feeling the opportunity slipping through his fingers. You don't just want the inheritance, you want peace, the chance to fix what's been broken. Think of everything you've lost over the years because of your choices. Richard was torn. He didn't know whether to feel relieved or even more pressured. The idea of having to accept his son while being forced to confront his past failures left him paralyzed. This can't be the only reason for me to accept him, he said, his voice trembling. This isn't love, it's a bargain. Maybe life is a negotiation, Richard, Angela interjected, her voice firm. You need to decide what truly matters. Your image or your family? She looked him in the eye, hoping he would see the truth in her words. Jonathan, sensing the rising tension, tried to calm the situation. I understand this is difficult, but think about what this reconciliation could mean. Not just financially, but emotionally. You could have the chance to rewrite your story to be a true father. At that moment, something within Richard began to shift. He had always lived for what others thought of him, but now, faced with the possibility of a fresh start, he found himself questioning his priorities. Memories of Angela and Michael, their smiles and the pain he had caused, began to flow through his mind. And if I accept? Richard finally asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. What does that mean for us, for you, Michael? It means we can try to build something together, Michael replied, hope beginning to shine in his eyes. I don't just want your money, I want your recognition. I want to know that you're willing to be my father, not just because of an inheritance, but because it's what life deserves. Richard took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. He looked at Jonathan, then at Angela, and finally at Michael. He realized that reconciliation wasn't just a financial matter, but a chance for emotional renewal, a possibility for rebuilding broken bonds. Yes, I accept, Richard said, his voice now firm and resolute. I accept you, Michael, as my son. He turned to Angela, his expression softening. And you, Angela, will be part of my life again. I want to repair all of this. A wave of emotion swept through the room. Michael could hardly believe what he had just heard, and with tears in his eyes, he ran to embrace Richard. Angela, her heart overflowing with relief, joined the hug, feeling that they were finally taking the first steps toward healing. Life wouldn't be easy, but in that moment, they were ready to face the future together, with forgiveness and acceptance, creating a new beginning where love triumphed over the past. We have reached the end of this touching story. If you enjoyed it and want to see more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Right now, there's a playlist of videos on your screen. If you want to keep watching these moving stories, just click on it and you'll start watching right away. And now tell us in the comments which city you're watching from and leave a like to support our work. Now a sincere question. Do you agree with what happened in the story? We want to hear your opinion. Until the next video.